Export Week and our session on key export controls. My name is Brian Beams. I am an international trade specialist with the U.S. Commercial Service and your host for the presentation. Some housekeeping items before we begin. This program is being recorded. During the presentation, audience members have two options to ask questions. You can either write your question in within the Q&A box, or please raise your hand. And once the speaker acknowledges your hand raised, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Everyone is asked to stay on mute if not speaking. There is still time to register for other Export Week sessions. You can visit the list of all 18 events by visiting trade.gov. Lastly, the views and opinions expressed during this program may not reflect the official policy and position of the U.S. government. I'd like to just take a minute to inform the audience about the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the trade and investment arm of the U.S. federal government, a division of the International Trade Administration. Our mission is to promote U.S. exports, protect U.S. commercial interests abroad, and facilitate foreign direct investment into the United States. We have a global reach. Our domestic field has over 100 offices. Internationally, our offices are located within the U.S. Embassy and consulates in over 70 countries. I'd like to now introduce Jim Trubits and Kristen Morneau, our friends at Mohawk Global. A little background on today's presenters. Jim Trubits is the Vice President of Business Development for Mohawk Global. Jim has over 40 years of knowledge with free trade agreements, customs compliance, logistics, and supply chain management. His experience encompasses courier, sea, air, and northern border operations. He is a regular speaker for the International Trade Group, including Ontario Exports and the Buffalo World Trade Association. Jim earned his BA from SUNY Buffalo and went on to complete an executive program in supply chain management at the L'Oreal Institute. He is also a graduate of the International Air Transportation Association's Air Cargo Training Program, graduating with distinction. Finally, Jim is a licensed customs broker and a certified customs specialist. Kristen Morneau is a senior consultant with Mohawk Global. Kristen is also a licensed customs broker and certified customs specialist who has worked in international trade compliance and logistics for nearly 3 decades. Prior to joining Mohawk, Kristen worked with Microsemi FTD in Beverly, Massachusetts as the senior manager of global logistics and compliance, where she managed licensing of EAR and ITAR commodities and shipping activities. Her experience with manufacturers have given her the opportunity to create and manage import and export compliance, CPAT, and training programs while being part of the supply chain and customer operations. Kristen's duties include import and export gap analysis, compliance manual development, product classification, and commerce and state licensing assistance and training. Without further ado, I welcome Jim Trubits. Jim, take it away, sir.
Brian, thank you so much. Kristen, I'm going to let you start off. What do you say? Sound good?
Sounds good. Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, Jim. This will be a fun conversation today. So I'm still showing our today's speaker slide. So today we're going to be presenting to you our key export controls. And when we're thinking about export controls, we're thinking about what's going on in the world nowadays, about what we have to worry about when we're exporting product, when we're exporting technology, when we're operating in this global economy. One thing we've all seen during this pandemic is how much we've seen supply, demand. We've heard issues with transportation. The concept of exporting is very important and very key to our economy. It's key to us as people buying products. We want to be able to get products that we're making around the world, be able to ship between countries. So it's really important to know that around all of that, there's a bunch of regulations and there's a bunch of basic requirements that people have to look at. So today, Jim and I are going to present that to you, and we're going to take a walk through here. So to start with, why are you here today? So you're here today because somewhere in your business there's something of the international expansion happening, or you're already working in international trade. So what you're going to be here to learn today is about those basic requirements to make sure as you're being an exporter, whether you're a seasoned exporter or a new exporter, that you know what those items are. And in doing that, your goal here is going to be to reduce things such as voluntary disclosures. So you're going to hear through today that, good companies have made mistakes. They've had to pay their fines and penalties and move on. What we want to help protect you against is the need to have to go through that process, but also to understand when that is the appropriate next step to take. We also want to, in some cases, be able to help you to avoid personal liabilities. So we see a lot of fines and penalties out there for corporations. There's also the fact that at times these may be on a person too, or a person only as an individual. So we want to help make sure that as you're working on your sales agreements or your shipping transactions, that you understand your role in the transaction as well as your company's role in the transaction. And most importantly, from the government's perspective, they want you here because of national security. So it's very important to the U.S., to the customs enforcement groups, to make sure that exporters understand their role in trade and be able to help prevent things such as terrorism. And you're thinking, well, terrorism, illegal trade with my basic type of commodity that's not very controlled? Well, we're going to have cases where we need to think about who we're shipping to, what country we're shipping to, the opportunity for it not to end up in the hands of who we're expecting it to end up in. So all around, for all commodities, there is a basic impact of national security. And BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security, and our export enforcement people really like to see that exporters, potential and existing, receive training. So we're going to go through that training today and hopefully answer any questions any of you have around exporting. So what do you think, Jim? What do you want to add to that?
I want to make a couple important points here, I think, too. And one of them, Kristen, is exporting isn't a privilege. It's a privilege. It's not a right. And, your company really needs your support to do this. When it comes to compliance, especially export compliance, from the shipping department up to the top of the corporation, everybody in that C group all the way down has a role to play in export compliance. And, so it was interesting. You and I talked about this earlier today, but there was a recent penalty case that was in the news wires this morning. And one of the things that the BIS said is, if this company that doesn't pay the penalty and doesn't do what they committed to do for their export violation, they're going to revoke this exporter's export privileges if it doesn't pay the fine or complete the training. So you talked about training earlier already. Training's one of those important things you can do, and as you can see here, non-compliance has a cost just like compliance does. But non-compliance, is you're going to see with this next slide with penalties, is actually more expensive sometimes than the cost of compliance. The one thing that I wanted to mention, Kristen, and you and I talk about this all the time, no expert has to go it alone. There's plenty of resources to help them. And so I think that's something that everybody has to keep in mind, is like, whoa, we don't have this real big department, there's a lot of information out there, and that willingness from the government to get it right from the beginning. And so that's a lot of it, I think, Kristen. I'm sure you agree with that there.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair statement, that more and more fines and penalties and press releases that we say use that word training in there, or they add in there that a certain percentage of a penalty is to be utilized internally for a compliance program. We saw recently in one of the press releases on Flare Systems that it was for them to have 2 external audits done. So it's the government's way of saying that they do want to be able to support international trade, but be able to make sure that we're supporting legitimate international trade. So those penalties do happen. And sometimes, for some companies, Jim, that press release might actually be a little bit more of a soreness than the money itself. So it's important to know that those press releases, the revocation of the export privileges, those can actually have the opportunity to happen. And the cash penalties on top of it.
Yeah,
Right?
and it's interesting, Kristen. Every year in January, they they actually, due to inflation, increase these penalty amounts. So if you have an export penalty that's associated with the Export Administration Regulations, also known as the EAR, you're looking at almost $309,000 could be that penalty. If it's something as simple as failing to do an AES filing, you're looking over 14 grand for an AES filing not done right. And then if your goods are subject to something called the ITAR, right? And we're going to talk about ITAR in a second. You're talking almost $1.2 million for a penalty. So it's not that hard. We're, better to get it right from the beginning and take a little bit of calm and caution on stuff. Is a lot better than having to try to answer questions later.
Most definitely. Plenty of resources out there and trade groups willing to be able to help. So what can happen to you? And this is where, we got to get some of that over with in the very beginning and talk about some of the things which can pop up. So we pulled a couple of headlines for you, one of them being California gentleman who was arrested, charged with illegally exporting cesium atomic clocks to Hong Kong. So in this type of case, what is the type of thing that can happen? Well, you think, well, he's exporting a product to Hong Kong. Well, ultimately, some concerns came up that ultimately these goods were on their way to China as opposed to Hong Kong. And we've all seen the changes with the relationship between Hong Kong and China and U.S. export controls over the last year or so. The other thing about this gentleman was that it's a product that has some control levels to it. We're going to talk about controls today and when products might actually need an export license versus not needing a license. This is the type of product that from the manufacturer and shipper, they know that for a lot of countries to export to, this would end up needing a license. So for this gentleman, for the actions that he took, he ultimately ended up with a potential for 20 years in prisons, 3 years of unsupervised release, and then on top of there, potential for 10 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. So this is one of those that shows you, and this case has now come to fruition with some slightly different end results in there, but it shows you that there is a potential for significant monetary fines, prison sentence, which could be considered a supervised release, but also that revocation of privileges and this notification out there. So these companies now that get involved in these, it's known. People are going to be able to read about this in their daily trade alerts, go on the BIS website, and you're happy to see in their press room all types of good stuff that's been going on lately. And another one that we wanted to highlight a little bit for you, our next one there, is looking at a case where, and this is where we talk a little bit about individual people as opposed to just corporations, where we had an engineer who had actually been working and helping on a scheme to obtain ICs, integrated circuits, that were ultimately exported to China without an export license. Now, in this case, this is one of those where you had a company who was involved in it, but you also ended up having a person, this engineer who was, maybe they didn't fully understand in the beginning why it was such a big deal what they were doing, but they knew, they were told at some point in this, that they needed to be able to make sure they had an export license for this specific commodity to China. So they derive their own scheme to be able to get around that. And we see that. We see companies that will set up a person in the US and then ask them to ship the product with a different ECCN associated with it, change the description, change the value. But ultimately, that US person can face liabilities. And in this case, he faced a statutory maximum sentence of 219 years in prison. So that's an awful long time.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about, do I want to fall out there and be one of the people who does this kind of thing? Well, make sure you understand your requirements. Make sure you understand those rules, because 219 years is an awful long time not to see your family members. And, in this case, there could have been the opportunity of getting that license or the opportunity to learn why a license wouldn't have been approved for this party and to be able to help support good commerce and avoid these type of things. And our last one that we wanted to highlight a little bit for you was FLIR systems. And, this one, for anybody who's, and I know we've got some interesting trade professionals on the call here today. We've all been hearing about flare systems over the years, and let's face it, this one here isn't the latest headline on flare systems. So just this week, Flare Systems had another press release happen on them, talking about some information that they had given to Commerce. And you can see that this is a type of company which has been through some recurring type of issues. In their last penalty before this was a real push that some of the fines and penalties go to their internal program, and their internal program along with 2 independent audits. So in this case, the government wanted to make sure that 2 individual companies were going to make sure this company was putting the right things in place and then sticking to those things, that the lessons of the past did not fall to the wayside. So for that latest one was where it was a total of $30 million, along with part of that going to those programs. So we've seen different things pop up for flare systems over the years. We saw the most recent headlines this week talking about the reporting of information to Commerce. So the government is gonna see these things. Eventually, these type of things do end up catching up with companies. And once you've gone out there and had an issue once, you're going to obviously have that attention moving forward. So if you make a mistake, something goes wrong, work with the right kind of people to fix that issue, and then make sure you're moving on in a compliant manner. It's not going to be one of those that all of a sudden you turn a corner and you're never going to see eyes on you again. So make sure you put those right things in place and stick to them. Right, Jim?
Yeah, Kristen, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that's rather interesting is a lot of times when you see these penalty cases or settlement of them, there's usually a probationary period afterwards to make sure that, what you say you're going to do, you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you get it right and you go forward, they're, they're happy. They want you to be successful. Um,
Yeah, they
so
want you to be successful and they want you to be a partner. These enforcement agencies, particularly people which are dealing with more type of higher advanced technologies and dual use type of commodities, they want to know that should you see something that doesn't seem right, that you're going to be able to work with the government too. So it's a really good message that, figure out if you've made a mistake by happenstance or lack of knowledge, move on from that mistake and turn into a solid exporter and gain that relationship.
exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the regulations, okay? And one regulation, regardless if you fall under ITAR goods or under the EAR, you have to make sure your goods meet the foreign trade regulations. And that's the actual AES, the Automated Export System, where you're doing EEIs, uh, electronic export information filings. When we're doing something like this, it's so important that you understand those requirements, regardless if you fall into the EAR or the ITAR. And so I try to usually use this as an analogy just so people understand. So this is probably the big juncture. This is like no different than if you were going to go to the motor vehicle and one time register a motorcycle and the next time register your boat. You're going to get in 2 different lines. So if your goods are subject to military applications, then you may fall under the ITAR, which is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. So you need to understand those rules and requirements. Or if your goods are more civil application, but could have possible applications in other scenarios for end use or controlled under what's called the Commerce Control List. Sorry for all the acronyms. We're going to get a lot of those today. Those would fall under the EAR, which is the Export Administration Regulations. And here's my earmarked, beat up copy of it. And I have this thing tabbed to death. And it's just good for travel kind of thing. I also use the one online. That being said, there's a lot of great information, Kristen. If they were wanting to understand these requirements, the government actually, the BIS has great little YouTube videos that you can watch to understand some of this in greater detail. If there's questions, and we're always available for questions too. We encourage it.
There's definitely been a push by these agencies to get more information out to us. And do keep in mind, some of you out there may have other governing agencies that get involved too, aside from either the EAR or the ITAR. So in certain cases, if you're going to be doing alcohol, tobacco, firearms, that type of stuff, you may have additional permitting. Certain areas you may have for different type of medicinal purposes and things like that. So be very conscientious that if your commodity is one of those which has other regulatory concerns in the US, there's a good chance that you're going to have some kind of requirement you also need to meet, either with your exportation or the ability for your customer to import into another country.
Great point. Um, you know, I think sometimes there's some confusion on what's considered an export because, most shipments people can get if it's going by ocean or air, by land to either Canada, Mexico, or to another country, you know, people can understand that. Um, the hand carries, I've had more people, um, you know, our sales guy was going to go see a customer and he was bringing a prototype with him and now he's handcuffed at JFK airport. And then you find out that they didn't do the AES filing. They didn't get this stuff was controlled and they didn't get a license. So sometimes you have to think about that as well. We're going to talk about deemed exports on the next slide to a degree, but then you also have stuff where you may actually move your items to another country and they'll sit in an inventory situation for a resale. And if this case goes from, let's say, the Netherlands and it's going to be resold to someplace in the Middle East, you may actually need to get a re-export license in a scenario like that, where it might not have needed a license to get to the Netherlands, but it might need to be re-exported. And then, certain items like technical services, training, meetings, repairs, you know, sometimes these are controlled. Probably the most important thing we want to talk about is deemed exports. And so, Kristen mentioned this earlier, actually. Software is a hot item right now. They're watching that very carefully. The other thing that they look at is technical data. If the item is controlled, most likely the software is going to be controlled or the technology could be controlled in many cases. So it's so important that people look and understand, I'm not going to send the item out, but I'm going to send the drawing out. That drawing could be controlled. And this is one of my favorite. We talked about that earlier. Deemed export a second ago was on the previous slide. This is like one of my favorite ones. If Kristen's a foreign national and her and I are having a meeting and I slide a blueprint across the table to her and she looks at it, it's considered an export to that foreign country that she's a resident of or residents of, depending on circumstances. So it's considered the same as exporting that technology to that country. So this is something to be careful with. And sometimes we'll see it where people will go to a trade show, people will give a tour of their building. They can unwittingly release technology to a foreign person. And so Kristen and I just worked on this a couple of weeks ago. We just helped someone create a technology control plan. So if your technology is controlled, they want you to have a silo around the information so it's not easily accessed.
There's to add on there from their Jim, as we saw another press release this week that involved Honeywell and some software issues. Then understanding where your software, if that is actually your product, where that's being downloaded and utilized. Is it being transferred by a customer to employees in an embargoed nation? That actual license and that ability to use that intellectual property is constituting an export. So it's very safe to say that our world is continuing to evolve. It's no longer just putting the plastic item in a box and shipping it overseas. It's getting much more into advanced technology, intellectual property, which we know has been a big concern, particularly with China, as well as these software applications and that technology behind it, like you said, whether it's the having the conversation and explaining to somebody the secret sauce of how your commodity is designed, or it's sharing those blueprints, making sure that you've got those right elements in place to make sure if it is a foreign person that you've got your right kind of either record keeping or potentially license requirements in place. Now that doesn't mean that you can't go out to dinner with that engineer and talk about, the football season or whatever sport they're into and have a nice cocktail. But what it does mean is that when you're talking about your product, you're going to want to stick to the public domain and assure that you're not getting into information which is considered proprietary.
Very good. I agree.
So, as we've thrown a bunch of acronyms at you already, so alphabet soup is kind of fun on a Tuesday afternoon. So as we think about this whole thing about EAR and ITAR, if you're coming up with a commodity and you're going, okay, I'm designing this to be used by somebody on the commercial side, but I see the potential if I do some tweaking to it that I might be able to get some either kind of government or government contracts, defense contracts into this type of product. So I see it both in both spaces, or the vice versa, that I've got some government funding in order to be able to do this product and it's going to be used in a military application, but there's a way that I can make some tweaks to it and be able to have it on the commercial side too. So this is one of the first questions you have to ask yourself with your product is, what is it? Is it being designed for a military type of purpose? And how do I go ahead and make sure that I know those classifications? The government's here to help you. So the government, aside from puzzling through pages and pages of regulations, has set up abilities for exporters to come to them and be able to say, is this under ITAR? I think it is. So we can do that through our Department of State, through a commodity jurisdiction. And if we're knowing that it's very heavily on the dual use, or State Department has said no, that's going to be controlled on the commerce side, we can go right to the Commerce Department and we can request a commodity classification from them too. They'll go ahead and we'll present to them what we believe our ECCN should be and have them come back and be able to confirm that yes, your export commodity control number is what you think it is, or give you the increased guidance on what it may be. We find that a lot of these CCATS requests on the commerce side are also happening because we're shipping to our European allies. And given our World Trade Organization and other type of trade agreements in place, they may have some very similar export controls. So that product you're shipping to Sweden, for example, may not need any kind of license. There's no issue with that going to your type of customer in Sweden. But if that customer in Sweden has the intent possibly to ship it on to somewhere such as China or into the Middle East, maybe now it needs a license. So that's what they're going to ask you for that type of information, just to make sure that they've also got themselves protected. And you've got multiple government agencies who get involved here. It's interesting for those of you who do export licensing. I myself do export licensing for some clients, and it's interesting to sometimes see the agencies which fall into the review cycle for export licenses. So, you may end up having peripheral agencies involved, such as Department of Energy, some of the military entities on an actual license application. But in the high level, what we've got is that the Department of State is in charge of our ITAR. They're going to be the ones that are going to be able to review any licensing requests, answer any questions. They're the ones who are going to hold true to the regulations of the ITAR. The Department of Commerce and the Bureau of Industry and Security, those are going to be your writers and your gatekeepers for the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations. Now, if you're thinking, okay, well, my product is very, very innocuous, it's toys, it's a handbag, it's something like that, you are still going to have responsibilities under the Export Administration Regulations. You will hear terminology times of if it's controlled by the EAR. What it also means, though, is that there's general principles in the EAR that need to be followed, and we're going to walk you through those basics today. The things you have to do for what we call the paperclip classifications, which you're going to know is EAR 99. You still can't ship them to the bad guys. They can't go to North Korea. There's going to be different rules you have to follow. But if you're first thinking, do I have to worry about State Department for my item that's got some military, but it's got some civilian application to it, you're going to be asking yourself these words here. Is your product designed specifically, repaired specifically, assembled specifically to a military specification? In that type of case, you're going to be leaning towards the State Department and the ITAR. And that's typically where somebody who's leaning, if they're not quite sure which way they go, they're first going to go to State Department and let State Department either say, yes, you're in the right place, or they're going to be able to say to you, nope, bop on over to Commerce, and Commerce will help you out. Okay? So is it specially designed, or is it actually some new terminology we've had in the ITAR recently? Could it be an item that's specifically excluded? There are times for those of you in the ITAR space or those of you in the commerce space, but occasionally hear about military stuff where something gets an ITAR stamp and you're surprised that it's stamped as ITAR because it's an off-the-shelf kind of commodity. Well, maybe there's a chance that you've got a document that might be marked incorrectly, because there are certain things that are excluded from the ITAR in these catch-alls, such as your nuts and bolts and things like that. So you do have to ask yourself these questions, and in the regulations, they're going to give you a lot of good guidance. And like Jim said, both agencies have done a very good job updating their websites over the last 4 or 5 years, and they've given a lot of tools as well as some different abilities for you to walk through steps to determine classifications. We always tell people to err on the side of caution using those tools, though, because ultimately the tool can only give you guidance, and sometimes is only as good as the information you put in. So we do want to be careful on those, then. Okay, but figuring out who has that product first is most important.
Oh, exactly. Well, that is really the starting point, Kristen. I agree with you. One of the things that I always try to relay to everybody is it's so important to understand your product. And we're going to talk now about the Export Administration regulations. In particular, we're going to talk about something called the Commerce Control List. In the Commerce Control List, as you're going to see, deals with a lot of commodities that have controls on them. So if your goods fall into one of these categories, then you might need to have an export license to do this. But so this is where things are going to be very important. And this is where I see time and time again where your engineers are going to be your best friend. I mean, that engineering team's key to your classification process. And so, you know, we're going to see on this next slide coming up in a second how important it is to understand technical specifications. Or in some cases, you'll see that they name special end uses that come to bear. But and this is where Chris and I are going to go back and forth on this, is that when you look at the Commerce Control List and you look at a particular ECCN number, you're going to see that there's controls on it. So this one's got national security controls, it's got military technology controls, and then anti-terrorism. So let's just look at some of the requirements to see if we had an Aero gas turbine engine that we wanted to export, would our goods qualify? So this is where it gets very specific. And one of the things, one of my dear friends always said that he doesn't like about the Export Administration regulations, but a lot of times when you read the Export Administration regulations, they actually send you to another place in the regulations. And so sometimes, you know, look at this one in A, they're sending you to look at the various technologies. They cite 3 different references there. Then you have to go to supplement 1 in part 743. And on top of it, there's a condition that it's intended to power non-military manned aircraft, not unmanned aircraft, but civil air type applications. And there's a second condition, designed to power an aircraft designed to cruise at Mach 1 or higher for more than 30 minutes. So in a situation like this, you need the engineers to help you really review this. And, you know, I can't stress enough that once you go through this process, how important it is to document it. If you've got the engineers in the room and they go through and said, yeah, we looked at 9003A, H, and I, and this is why, you know, it meets one of those conditions. Yes, we're certified as civil air, and this is going to be non-military application. And yes, it does Mach 1 or higher. you're going to want to make sure you document that, because it might not be next month. It might not even be for a year or two, but someone might ask, how did you come up with that ECCN number? And you want to have good documentation on it.
You know, and Jim, you mentioned a really good point that those key words there at the bottom of at the end of the second line of text, of which meet all of the following. There will be some times when you look at these technical parameters and it will be an and statement that it needs to meet all of them. There'll be other times where it's an or statement, where it only needs to meet one of those specifications. So I don't know, maybe a little Dungeons and Dragons type of action that you've got to pay very close attention to that terminology, whether it's all and or. And from there, make sure that you're looking at any of those elements that it's pointing to too. So it's well laid out, but it's a lot of looking around, and you got to make sure you take each of those steps.
So let's take a step back, Kristen, and maybe you can explain how that Commerce Control List is set up for everybody.
So, you know, we got to love our acronyms, and we have to love our, you know, our ways that things are classified. So on the EAR side, we've got what we call those ECCNs, the Export Commodity Control Number. We saw on the last slide that we had a Aero Turbine engine classified as 9A001. So what you can see on the left-hand side are the commerce categories. So an ECCN is going to start with a number that's going to be 0 through 9. In our case, for our product, it was a 9. We can see for each of the type of descriptions of what we're building here. We're starting out in 1, once we move past nuclear and miscellaneous, at a very type of microorganism toxin material type of level, moving up through electronics, computers, into telecommunication and information security, getting all the way to navigation equipment, marine, and ultimately to aerospace and propulsion. So those numbers do build in the level of severity on how they're going to actually be looked at as an overall commodity. So there's our aerospace and propulsion. And then from there, we're going to see that we've got an A. So what does the A mean to us? So A, in our next group here, we see the 5 product groups. A is going to be the actual product, system, equipment, or components. Now, Jim and I have talked a little bit about technology already. We've talked about software that may be used for something, sometimes maybe an ingredient to a chemical that you're manufacturing. Those are going to start to fall into those other letters of B, C, D, or E. So when you say that you've got something that's controlled, the product is 9A001, odds are pretty good the associated technology is likely going to be under 9E001. Maybe not all the elements of the technology, but the elements of the technology which make the product controlled is 9A001. So that's where you've got to think outside of the box and not just think about the product, but think about potential equipment to design it as well as that related technology. Then our last part here is those numbers, that 001. You're going to see in ECCNs a lot of 001 and 002. Those that end with a 00 and 1 number are going to be higher controlled than Category 9. They're going to be the items that have the most licensing requirements on them and the articles that have the most sensitivity from a national security perspective. When you see that number start to get to high digit numbers, and in some ECCN families, you'll see 994 or 999, that's an indication that it's a much lower level of control of a product within that category. To the point that quite often those that may be a 9A994 may have a very low level of control, but it's making sure that you understand as the exporter that in this product, which does have a lot of national security risk to it, that we do have certain things that are going to be higher control and then items that are going to be lower control. So that's a good little bit on how they lay things out for you. Now, I mentioned the word paperclip classification. We've got a note down here at the bottom that if you have a product that you went through these and you don't see an ECCN that makes sense for your product, and it's a very innocuous, no military or dual use application, it's probably going to fall under what we call EAR 99. It's not EAR 99, it's EAR 99 for Export Administration Regulations, and 99 being that catch-all at the end. So when we talk about shipping something as innocuous as a mug or a paperclip or a pen, that is going to be an article that's EAR 99, meaning that it itself is not a controlled commodity, but it is an export from the United States, which still needs to follow regulations. How does that work, Jim?
I'd say you did a great job there, Kristen. And if you look here, there is that one little fine statement at the end too. It says, if you plan to export an EAR item to an embargoed country to an end user of concern, which we call bad guys, right? Or support prohibited end use, you may be required to obtain a license. And so, depending on circumstances, if it's someone that's going to be sending something to a country of concern, a person of concern, or possible end use of concern, you could need a license, even if it's EAR 99. I think that, we can't stress that enough, because that's where people sometimes get tripped up, just because it's EAR 99, you still really need to do your due diligence on the rest of it. We'll talk more about that.
So, and that just summarizes for you that we were talking that the product itself is going to be that 9A, and we can see that the ones that were related for technology were going to be 9E001 through 9E003. So a little bit of fun reading to do with your engineer to see exactly where those fall. Now for 9A001, Jim had mentioned before the reason for control. So this is how you're going to actually see it quite often listed is NS with a 1, MT with a 1, AT with a 1. Sometimes that number may be 2, and there may be other 2-letter codes which you see. And we're going to actually be able to show you an example of that. Each of those are a different type of category. And then from there is going to bring us into the actual listing itself. So in here, what we did is we pulled for you the 9A001 and we pulled 9A991. So 9A001 being the high-end level of control within category 9, and 9A991 being a much lower level of control. What you can see is on the 001, you're going to have NS1, MT1, and AT1 as we've discussed. However, when we get to 9A991, we can see that the controls are a little bit different. We can see that we do have that AT1, that anti-terrorism column 1, but we can see that we've also got this UN application for certain commodities, but we've lost that NS1 and we've lost that MT1. So it really does ultimately depend on the level of the control is going to dictate which kind of reasons for control that you say. So once you've taken a look and you see, okay, I see that my product is NS1. I want to ship it to some country. Let's take a look now at what's called the Commerce Country Chart. And we go, okay, I want to ship NS1. And I can see in this column, we can see here that's highlighted for NS1 that a few different countries highlighted. We pulled the case section for you. So you can be able to see in this case, this product would need possibly an export license going to Korea. Going to what else we got there? Kosovo. So we can see that anything that's highlighted in here is going to need a license unless there's a case for a very specific license exception. But once you've hit this point that your country is one of those that's identified, that's where you're going to want to stop and do the due diligence to see if you actually need a license. Okay. And we can see in there that the MT1, as that populates, we can see that we've got the same group of countries which had populated. So we had the same group here. And then ultimately, as we get to the AT1, we can see that there's actually, if we look in AT1, in this part, there's nobody listed there, no countries listed. However, if you do take a look at the chart down there, see under Korea North, see how it says, see different sections? So those are other parts of the Export Administration regulations, which are essentially going to say to you that a license is required for anything going to North Korea. It's going to be a country which faces sanctions and embargoes, and there's going to be very rare cases where a product can be able to ship. And that's where we're saying the EAR 99 products are going to be a problem for going to a country such as North Korea. But let's face it, people want products everywhere. So there is a chance that you could see the potential for somebody ordering products in a different country that does not have a control, and you run the risk of diversion over to a country such as North Korea. That's a little bit of an excerpt from the list to see that you're going from your product to understand the control on it. Then you're going to the commerce country list to figure out how that control impacts your transaction. Sound good, Jim?
Sounds good. So many times, Kristen, I've seen this where people say, well, for this country, we didn't need a license. You can see that it really does come down to the country you're going to that, national security may not be affected for some countries, and other ones it will. So give you an example, chemical and biological. They constantly are changing what countries require a license and which ones don't. So it's important to be familiar with the Commerce Country Chart, CCC, and just make sure that you're looking to see if you need a license or not for that particular situation, that particular country.
And what's important to also know is that these charts change. So it's not very frequent, but sometimes these countries do get a little bit of a change in them. We recently saw in the last couple of years the changes with Hong Kong, more in line with China now. And we had also seen that some of the risk levels on Mexico had gotten lowered approximately 5 or 6 years ago. So changes do happen. So it's important that while Jim has his copy that's printed out there, that if we're going to look at something as a reference chart, always go back to the original online version.
I totally agree. I mean, a lot of this is just quick reference, but I'll do my due diligence and go online because things change constantly. One of the things that we really want to talk about is, like, let's face it, you don't want to be Comtech. They paid 122 K for illegally exporting controlled goods to Russia, the UAE, and Brazil. What they did was they incorrectly classified this stuff as EAR 99. And so this is one of the questions I get all the time, Kristen. What's my options for classification? One, if you're not the vendor, you could always ask the vendor for assistance. You could, 2, self-classify your goods. Or 3, get that, commodity jurisdiction or CCAT, that classification decision. But I noticed with certain items, many exporters are going and getting some type of commodity jurisdiction or CCAT. Self-classifying is fine. But it's important, like I said, document your findings and why you determined that those goods were that ECCN or that EAR 99. It's important. That's just part of that process because that's the first step. You're gonna say, okay, walk me through. What are some of the steps that I should be doing? Okay, so this is like my favorite summary slide of all time, and I'm glad Kristen let me do this one because this is like one of my favorites. Like, so first things first, you got to classify it and determine what it is. This is so important, and then you got to know where it's going. And sometimes when you're selling through a distributor, they don't really want to tell you that, but you really need to know that for ultimately determining, because especially if the goods are controlled or they possibly could be sent to an embargoed country. When you hear the word reseller, distributor, you know that they're a trading company, the goods are going someplace else. So this is very important. And then who's getting these goods? Let's face it. We have a consolidated screening list you can use through the trade.gov that probably has 7,000 parties on it that you're not allowed to really export to without possibly a license, or maybe not at all. And then last but not least, we want to know what's going to be the end use of the goods. And a lot of times people feel like they're being nosy, but they really need to know this information. And look at this one I read about earlier today. They didn't ask for an end use certificate of any sort, trying to determine what the end use was. And if it's going to be used for nuclear, military end use, chemical, biological weapons, any of those could trigger a license or a license exception. And some commodities we're going to see really don't allow for a license exception. So that means your only option is to apply for a license. Not a big deal. Kristen, how hard is it for you to apply for a license? Normally if you have all the information and you're plugging it in to SnapR, how long does it normally take you to do that?
Oh, yeah, the actual plug and play, if you've got all that information together, it's going to be a very quick, less than an hour type of thing to do. We typically find that once you've answered all of those questions and done your due diligence, it's taken a couple hours of work to pull that all together. And it is, it's the fundamental things that you need in order to apply for a license. So you're not going to know if you need a license without pulling those fundamental elements. Jim did say a very, I'm sure for a few people did a bit of a, how do I handle that with distributors? If you've got a product that's got a controlled ECCN on it, you've got to handle that one way. If you're dealing with something, for example, retail, and it's going to be something that is an EAR 99 going to be in a shop, and consumers will come and buy it, this is where you're going to look at due diligence. When Jim talks about what you need to look for, you're also going to give information to people. You're going to state on your export documentation that this stuff came from the US and that you have to follow the US rules. And that's while you can't hold the hand of the shopkeeper in a store in Italy, for example, you've given him the information that it's not supposed to be transferred to somebody who's in an embargoed nation. There's only so much that we understand people can control in a retail distributor sense, but the higher the ECCN of your product, the more you need to work into your distributor terms and conditions, what they are and what they are not allowed to do. And we're going to give you some good little tools on how to be able to do that. Right, Jim?
You got it. Thanks, Kristen. End use. This is probably one of the ones that we're seeing more and more buzz on. I think 2020 was really the year of end use, and particular military end use. There's a big focus by BIS right now on end use and military end use. So a lot of these universities in China, for example, they'll do research for automotive, and then they'll also do for military application, the same application. Maybe they're going to do a civil airplane and a military airplane, and there's a blurring. And because there's a blurring now, there's a concern that the information, the commodities that are shipped over there could be used not just for civil application, but for military application. So it's important to ask end use. And you're going to say, okay, what's the big deal with the nuclear reactor? I'm going to give you an example. There was a company back probably 10, 15 years ago now that sold $21,000 worth of thermal paint to a Pakistani nuclear facility and didn't get an export license. And they got penalized. And it was a big penalty. Some people did jail time. They arrested the sales manager when they came over from China. So there was quite a bit that happened with this whole thing. So end use is a big thing. And so, you want to make sure you know the end use of the goods. So you're going to say, look at, is there an official form? Yes, there is. This is what we call the BIS 711 form. Kristen and I also know of many end use certification forms that people use. So that end use certification form can be a generic form because some people get concerned if they're filling out a Department of Commerce form. But the information pretty much between an end use certificate and this form are identical. So, so if you're applying for a license still, Kristen, what's better, you think?
When you're applying for a license, the most official is the best. So being able to actually have this form, which is going to be signed by that overseas party, is going to be very much what BIS is looking for. They also love to be able to see any kind of statement on letterhead, which gives any additional information. Your goal always with these end-use statements when it comes down to licensing is for that licensing officer to envision what is happening in the application. Answer as much of those due diligence questions that Jim had mentioned up front. And in here is where you're going to get a lot of that who and how the product is being used. So the more detail in there, the more likely you're going to be on having success with the first time on a license application.
Sometimes when I see these end use certificates come back, the overseas party is very vague, and you may have to push back and ask for information. How many times have you gotten one of these sent to you and said, "Hey, what's your opinion?" And then you're gonna go, "You need more detail."
One of my favorite one is when they check off that box about it will be re-exported, and when you ask them where it's going to be re-exported to, and they say various. So that is one of those cases too, where you're going to need a little bit more information, particularly if your product is controlled. You're going to have to make sure that you've got the right information to that party to protect them in your ongoing trade relationship, but ultimately to make sure you did your due diligence and weren't self-blinding.
I almost feel like you set me up for this next slide.
Do I ever do that?
Let's put it this way. Like, when it comes to EAR, there's countries that you just can't send to without a license. And, you know, you got Cuba, right? You got North Korea, you got Sudan, you got Syria, you got Iran, but you also have places like Crimea in the Ukraine. However, and Kristen, I know you're going to add to this list, there's certain countries that are considered high risk. And some of the ones that there's particular interest by the BIS when they see these AES filings is Turkey, UAE, Hong Kong, and Singapore. One of my favorite lines about Singapore is, if everything that went to Singapore stayed in Singapore, the island would have sank years ago. So, you know, but this is so important that people understand that, you know, as you can see, there's quite a bit of concern with some of these countries here.
Most definitely. And, you know, we had our latest friend added to this list with Myanmar being included most recently. Yep. And that's where we say to you to always make sure that you're staying up to date on those controls. You know, Iran, we had seen a little bit of backing off, as well as Cuba, and then we saw that everything got fully reinstated. So it's very important to stay up to date with these, as well as those partials, like Jim said. There are ones that are very specific for Russia, for example, that really focus on the oil industry. If Russia could be a customer for you, you need to make sure that you read those sanctions on Russia specifically, as it does not affect every type of end user and every type of commodity. Right, Jim?
Yeah, the Russian sanctions are interesting because it's just not one notice. There's multiple notices that you have to review. So, you know, you want to make sure, and some of those fall under OFAC, some fall under the BIS. So, you know, if anybody needs help, we'd be glad to send you the information, but you'll want to make sure you've read them and understand them. So, you know, what I'm seeing still, Kristen, when we go through this is there's actually a trend now where they're not really sanctioning the country as much as the individuals.
Much so, much so. You're seeing much more that's really being based on individuals, individual corporations, individual parties. And this is the government's commitment to try to support as much legitimate trade as possible. And this is where screening comes into play. There's going to be lists that you need to screen. This is mandatory. It's mandatory to be saved. Record keeping evidence of 5 years of searching these lists. Back when Jim and I were, you know, first running around filling out Canary Orange export forms many decades ago, we would have to search a bunch of different lists, and they were a very manual type of search. We have reached the point that these lists of possible bad guys and bad entities have been consolidated for us. There is a free of charge website that you can go on, which does, as you can see here, it is a consolidated screening list. What we recommend to people is that if you're very new to exporting or low volume, use that consolidated screening list. Once you do your results, save a screenshot of it and make sure you save it with your other record keeping documents. Always make sure you have fuzzy name on. So fuzzy should just be the default for everything. Fuzzy logic always works. So the fuzzy logic is the ability to say that Jim may be a good guy, but under the name James, maybe he's not. So it's the ability for the computer to be able to pick up on intricacies and variations on names as well as on spelling. So fuzzy is one that we often recommend, as well as the fact that there are some entities that you will see on the list that have multiple DBAs as well as multiple addresses. So using fuzzy helps you to find them the best. Here's a couple of examples pulling up so you can get an idea of what this looks like. And you can see in here that we're looking at different entities of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is an entity which you quite often hear if you're looking at export news press releases that come out. And in this case, you've got somebody that they're on the unverified list. So there's going to be lists of control on what you need to do if you want to do business with this party. In most cases, what that's going to involve is that you're going to have to apply for an export license. An entity like this, when you do go ahead and you submit, is going to have a presumption of denial. So you do need to make sure when submitting for somebody on the unverified that you've got a lot of good supporting evidence as to why this is an appropriate transaction for the US government to get involved with. For example, if there's another US project which is dependent on this Chinese entity in order to do business. But we did see recently, with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, a variety of addresses will pop up. The Institute of Technical Physics has had different issues pop up over the years. So, into Jim's point, part of that concern too is that these educational institutes do some amazing, phenomenal, great work in advanced sciences. But those advanced sciences could end up being used by the wrong party in the wrong way, which is where the government, the US government, and our allies are going to put certain controls in place.
Two comments on the unverified list. BIS always said that if they can't verify that that's a bona fide affiliate, company, school, whatever, then how can you? So that was one of the things. The other thing that you got to keep in mind is if someone does wind up on the unverified list, besides needing an export license, it's mandatory that you do an AES filing for anybody that's on the unverified list. So that's an important thing. Kristen, this is like one of my favorite comments from a BIS report on a penalty case. And it says, nobody bothered to take 5 minutes to screen the recipient's name. And in this case, using the consolidated screening list that's on trade.gov, I don't think I've ever spent even 5 minutes doing the screenings. And even if there's multiple parties, it's really not that hard a process. And, and I always made sure that I printed the results to keep it with the file. Because, the last thing you want to do is, say, well, did you do it? Did you screen? Yes, but we never kept a copy. You have to prove that there was no results showing that this person could be a person of concern.
Yeah, it is one of those, if there's no records, then it never happened. And this does need to be on a transactional basis. So companies are added to this list, companies are taken off of these lists. We really urge people that when you're doing small volumes of exports, use that free of charge tool, do screenshots, and that's your record keeping. If you're starting to grow and you're having a large volume of exports going out repeatedly, look at different software tools that you can use that will also help you to flag that this customer was fabulous on June 1st, but now on June 20th, they're showing up on a list. So you want to make sure that you're doing this for all of your exports and scale that. And anything about an export compliance, you can always find a way to be able to scale, from working on very basic documentation to automation. So people like us can definitely help you out in any of those areas.
You bring up a great point still. So if you have a commodity that's a stock shelf item and you're just going to pull it off the shelf and ship it and export it, then you probably only have to screen a time of the order because it's going to go out the door, within hours or days. But if you have something that's going to take you months to build or years to build, you're going to probably have to check before you actually accept the order while you're doing the production on this order. And then last but not least, before it's exported, because things can change dramatically. So this is something to keep in mind, depending on circumstances. The other thing when it comes to screening, Kristen, if you have steady customers and let's say they're household names, you're probably safer where you could probably screen once a year on them and be safe. I'm not saying always, but you know what I'm saying? Like, if you're selling to like a large electronics company overseas that, maybe makes, certain electronics TVs or things like that. And you would know probably, you could probably be safe only screening maybe annually on someone like that. But if you have new customers coming on and very unusual circumstances, you have to screen. And
Mhm.
and how much risk are you willing to take, I think is really what it comes down to. I know some companies, they, they're using software that takes and crashes their database every single day and looks for um, possible bad actors. So this is something important to keep in mind. So a lot of it depends on, your commodity that you're exporting and who you're selling to. So when it comes to red flags, and this is kind of one of the important things that we have to keep in mind. BIS issues this thing called red flags, and some of the red flags are typical things like, is the customer or their address found on one of these lists? We just talked about screening. Customer is willing to pay cash for a very expensive item when the terms of sale would normally call for financing. One of my favorites was this one company got a visit from an overseas party, and they brought a duffel bag of dollars and threw it on the table and said, "We want to buy that machine. Just crate it, and we'll have it picked up." And they had to walk away from the deal just because it was fraught with risk. That's a major red flag. You know,
And I'll
you
say right now, I think the largest red flag that we see day to day is when a ship to or a customer is listed as a trading company, an import-export company, or a freight forwarder. Odds are those are not going to be consumers of material. It's going to be another party. I myself have worked a case where that was what we had to disclose was we asked for an end user statement, but it was a trading company, and the company hadn't taken the next level. So what we were asked to do was to make sure all of our future trainings pointed out that trading companies are not going to be consumers. There's going to be a different end user involved, and make sure you ask those questions. So red flags can vary a little bit dependent on your business, your type of product. So that's where you really need to take the time in exporting to learn what your red flags are specifically for your product. And that may turn out to be things such as diversion risks. It could turn out to be, as we're saying here, that you've got trading companies or you have strange financing requests. So definitely watch out for those red flags. And BIS will give you plenty of great examples on their website, and there's plenty on ours too.
Oh yeah, exactly. When it comes to red flags, still, you really, you have to look for the obvious ones too, and you can't really self-blind. Um, how many times have we heard this now? You see something, say something, kind of thing. I know this one company, a Middle East bakery approached them to buy some expensive medical equipment. What would a Middle East bakery need with medical equipment? So, that's like a pure red flag. So, it's important to keep, you know, your eyes open. Um, Kristen, I think you got a good example here, don't you?
And these reflect back to those what could happen to that we talked about in the beginning. In the case of that Chinese, that entity who was shipping the product out of the country, the cesium clocks, they actually had a bill to and a ship to on their letterhead that was in the U.S., but the letterhead was in Chinese. So that was actually what triggered the shipper to be able to say, "Hey, wait a minute, is this actually staying in the U.S. because these goods would be controlled to China?" So that's where paying attention and doing that due diligence. And our next one that we have, Jim, is going to be another case where we ended up having an end user statement was a party in Saudi Arabia. However, the ship to is a trading company in the UAE. So this is where needing to make sure if I'm shipping it to the UAE, are you actually getting it to Saudi Arabia or is there another party involved in this transaction? So very important to make sure when you see those trading companies, you're verifying who the actual end user is. We actually had one recently where an end user was a chemical plant in Canada, and the product would be controlled for export not to Canada. To Canada, it's perfectly fine. But when looking at that entity, they actually showed that they had a presence in Iran. So being able to work with the Canadian entity on realizing that that product cannot be transferred to their Iranian entity, and what kind of controls can they put in place to assure that, as it would be in violation of US regulations. So something to be keenly aware of if your product has controls to certain countries is, does my customer in a country I can do business with have partner entities in a country that might be embargoed? Very important to take a look for, is a lot of our global trading partners do not have the same sanctions and embargoes as the United States. Another one here that for those of you who are you're getting more into dealing with the Middle East, a thing that we need to keep our eyes open for is looking for anti-boycott requests. And these are the type of requests where a party is asking you to not do business with a third party. The most common request that we know is the request not to be doing business with the nation of Israel or the Israeli nationals. This would be the Arab League boycott, which was initially started by Egypt, who actually Egypt has withdrawn themselves actually from the Arab League. And we've had a couple changes recently with the Arab League, but this is one that we do still see when relationships end up changing with Israel. So to be cautious on seeing statements like that of people wanting to see if there is anybody of an Israeli national or an Israeli origin product within your commodity. So very good things to be keeping your eyes on. There's a lot of different elements that can pop into play in international trade. So some of your best practices, you can't know everything, right? But you've got to try to make sure that you've got the basic principles in places and you've got the resources to be able to make sure you fill in your gaps, whether that's through third parties, newsletters, reading the regulations, whatever that is. But one of the things that BIS really pushes is that it's a best practice for that commitment to come from the senior level. If you've got a commitment statement in place and you show commitment from the C level of the organization, it's going to be easier for the entire organization to accept and revolve around compliance. If you're not seeing that senior commitment, it can be harder to get people at the lower levels to be able to comply with what must be done. So that commitment is very key. And we also have conduct training. So make sure that you're training your people. You've received some training today. Share what you've learned today with other people. Bring them to other trainings. Make sure that people who are integral to exporting are getting consistent training. Government likes to see 4 to 6 hours a year for people who are directly related to the transactions. So make sure that's happening.
Kristen, I was going to add one more thing here too. You know, a lot of these penalty cases now entail training, and you know, just give you an example, it says company must complete export compliance training within 1 year and submit its training certificates to the BIS. They're not joking on this.
And you want to make sure that you're making sure that you're documenting all of your processes, so that way you have a tangible system that can be looked at and it can be scalable. So as you're bringing new people on, they can look at these processes and be able to understand how to make sure that they're supporting the organization. Next one. Making sure you're properly classified. That's the nuts and bolts. When you're going to release a new product, make sure that you're looking at it ahead of time. Are you going to be able to ship this product to the markets that your salespeople or your business development people are focused on? So make sure you understand how your product is classified. And if you have any room for error on there, make sure you're either working with a trade professional or get those type of classification requests honored by Commerce or those commodity jurisdictions. Make sure that you're using those policies, procedures, and forms. Good companies make mistakes, but by having good processes and policies in place, it shows the best intent of the organization. So it's very key to make sure that those are up to date and that they do reflect current regulations. And I'm always one to say that if it's an export policy, you may have a summary of what they need to do within your process, but then go ahead and actually hyperlink to the regulation. Make sure people can always look at the most updated version of what it is that they need to be following.
One of the things I was going to say too is it doesn't have to be elaborate procedures. You don't need a 175-page manual if you can get it done in less, but some of this stuff has to be documented.
Most definitely. And monitor and make sure that you've got follow-ups on corrective actions. If you're an ISO certified company, become best friends with that ISO lead. Let the audits that you do periodically be done through ISO. If there is any type of corrective action, take advantage of that overall corrective action policy. Don't have to create your own one. Again, make it something that your whole company is getting involved in compliance. If you have made a mistake, if something has gone wrong, talk to a trade professional, do your due diligence, and then look and see if it's a case where you should be reporting that potential violation. If it's your concern over a party, the government most certainly wants to hear from you. That's why they ask you to attend these type of trainings, to make them alert to something that could be concerning for the U.S. But also, if you've done something that's wrong and you're going to turn a page and do something right, you need to make a business decision on if that's something that should be reported to make sure that those things can't come back at you. So the government, our import and export guys, they have a 5-year period that they can go back and look at things for audit purposes. So we do want to make sure that if we found something, that we don't just try to close a chapter on it. You may end up still receiving questions about that sometime over the next couple of years. So if a mistake happened, be forthcoming, and they are much more appreciative when somebody is forthcoming.
Kristen, I see this statistic over and over again where if you do a voluntary disclosure to the BIS, and it's not a reoccurring error, 3% result in a penalty. So most of the time they basically say, don't do this again. Thank you for letting us know, and move on. That's really the outcome. So you have a very low percentage of getting a penalty if it's something, if you're saying, oh, I can't believe this is the 17th time we've reported this violation. Yeah, that's different.
Which actually, Jim, as you roll into the next slide, somebody asked a question which has to do with fines and penalties and has to do with AES. They were referring to when you had mentioned $14,000 fine on AES. What they had said is that if they find that they had made some mistakes, don't they have the up to 5 years to make those corrections, or would they potentially be fined?
So here's my thoughts when it comes to AES best practices. They want you to take immediate action on this. So if you find out that you've been filing something wrong in AES and you don't do anything for 6 months or a year, that's probably not a good argument when you go to do your disclosure. Because how do you defend yourself saying, yeah, we found out 6 months ago, we just took our media correction action was 6 months later. They're looking for something more robust, something more immediate. So that'll be an important thing. And when it comes to AES filings, think about it. All that information that we learned today, we talked about the country, the commodity, the end user. Are they a reseller? Are they a direct consumer? Are they a government? All this information is going to go into that AES filing you're going to do. And so what is AES? It's the Automated Export System. And what is an EEI? It's the individual electronic export information filing pertaining to that export. And I always tell people, I said, think about it this way. You file your taxes once a year. Every time you have an export, you're doing a filing. They expect you to file it timely, accurately, and correctly. And so this information is going to be transmitted either by the self-filer or a freight forwarder into the AES system, and it goes to customs. But Kristen, as you mentioned earlier, when you do licenses, it goes to 40 different government agencies that have an interest in the export as well. I know for a fact that they're data mining the AES data and looking for anomalies. Is it going the AEI, United Arab Emirates? It's going here. Is it a certain commodity? They're looking at certain parties of interest and making sure. Integrated circuits, that's a big one right now. If they see an integrated circuit being exported, they're going to look and check the ECCN number on it. They're going to look at things like this. So it's so important that you're looking at this and paying attention.
Valuation has been a hot topic lately too. You know, we normally hear a lot about valuation on import, but there's also a lot of attention going on that to exports right now to make sure that people aren't trying to take advantage of either exceptions that may allow for not shipping with a license, or that they may be trying to help a foreign party be able to pay lesser in duties and taxes. So that is starting to pop up more and more.
So this is really what it comes down to, is paying attention to the AES filings, and good exporters are paying attention to that. They're reviewing their AES filings to make sure they're accurate, they were filed timely. If they have a third party doing it, they're verifying that the goods were properly exported on, with the filing and done timely. And some of the little things are the port of export. Sometimes it's the incorrect USPPI, because let's face it, Kristen, if we have a drop shipment, that changes that whole scenario. Who's going to be named as the USPPI on that drop shipment? Was it sold domestically or was it sold internationally? That's going to determine that. If the goods came in for repair and are going back out, you're going to have a different export info code. Or if something's going out on a trade show and coming back, it's going to have a different info code. Or if the goods are under license, they're going to have a different export info code. So this stuff is going to be important.
And I'll add to that, if you're shipping under, we had a person ask a question, Jim, actually wondering about, and for the question which they asked is rather detailed, and it gets a lot into the ITAR side of things potentially. But they're looking at a case where they have got an engine from overseas that would come into the United States and have some work done on it and then ship back out, and it's into the military type of space. There are different type of exemptions out there which people can utilize under certain conditions, and we'd have to understand a lot more about the specific situation with this in order to be able to help. But that if you are able to use one of those exemptions which do exist for repairs, you have to make sure that that exemption is filed in AES. There may be times, and there may be times that your exemption is an import and an export, and it had to be cited on both of those. So there are definitely opportunities. And for the person who asked about that, with about TAAs or licenses, that might be a better question to follow up with offline so we can learn a little bit more about your specific situation. Okay. And record keeping, the do all. If you don't document it, it never happened. So you are expected as an exporter under the regulations to maintain 5 years of record keeping. This has to be in a format that is recoverable and able to be presented upon request by the U.S. government. There are timelines that you can ask for more time to provide documents, but we'll always tell you that if the government is asking for documents for a post-shipment verification, for example, the prompter you're able to reply the best. And making sure in that record keeping that you've got all of the elements that are required. And this is literally going to be your quote to cash. They don't all have to be in one folder. They can be in different departments, purchase orders with customer service, shipping with shipping, but there has to be a common means in the entity to be able to recover those documents. And one thing to think about with record keeping too is that they will say to you always in record keeping and related communications. So those email conversations you had, the one where the engineer or the salesperson had a conversation with the customer about the terms of their order or some kind of condition of it, that they need it in a blue box because they're going to ship it somewhere else later. Those emails all have to be saved as part of your record keeping too. So we've all seen those cases of government agencies going in places and pulling out computers. They will find the emails if you don't save the emails. So particularly for controlled goods, make sure you're very cautious about that. And our key documents that you're going to have in your export records potentially, or that you're going to be using in the day-to-day transactions. These are actually documents that if you can join Jim and I on Thursday, we're going to be talking deeper, having a bit of a coffee talk, and be able to talk deeper into export documentation. But these are the most basic that you're going to be using. The commercial invoice is going to be your key document for shipping out the door, and typically what your customer is going to pay against. But by saying it's the commercial invoice, it's the commercial representation that's going to be given to their customs to be able to arrange their import and for you to substantiate your export in your AES filing. It's very important that your commercial invoice be your rules, your Bible, your everything that you follow, that you're very cautious of any type of errors on it, that if it's in Excel, that your calculations work correctly, because errors can result in delays. It can result in fees, and it could potentially result in seizures. We're seeing, I don't know about you, Jim, but I'm seeing more cases for exporters now saying that they're noticing that the countries that they're shipping to are asking a lot of valuation questions. So
Yep.
be very cautious that making sure that what you're doing is consistent, not just as an importer for the US, but exporting from the US. Changing a value on a sample shipment to be very low to help them not have to pay duties and taxes can be construed as actually a violation, that you're trying to actually help somebody absolve themselves from duties and taxes, which are the legal right of that nation. So make sure your information is accurate in your commercial invoice. That's your most important document. And we'll talk more about that Thursday over coffee, right, Jim?
You got it.
So then we have our SLI, and you're probably filling these out for freight forwarders. This is also known as a shipper's letter of instruction. This is going to give basically all the information on your commercial invoice, but then it's going to highlight a few other areas. It's going to add some elements to the transportation as far as, are you related parties? What kind of party is this you're dealing with? Is there a ECCN or United States military list code from the ITAR that needs to be listed? So this is going to be the tool which your freight forwarder is going to utilize to make sure that they know how to file your AES correctly, and they know whom is ultimately going to be responsible for different elements of the logistics and the clearance instructions. Now, on an SLI, some of the best practices and kind of things that we had for you here. First one pop up is that if it is signed, so your guys in the shipping departments, once you sign these, this is a legal document. If you read that fine print on an SLI when you sign it, you're actually giving limited power of attorney to the freight forwarder to make the AES filing for that transaction. Another reason why you want to make sure that the AES, the SLI, is shipment specific. We don't do blanket SLIs because we are speaking to the value and the attributes of the specific one-time shipment. So we can't do the blankets like you might be able to do on things such as certificates of origin. Elements will change transaction to transaction. Unsigned are not considered valid. So you are not giving that party the authorization to file on your behalf. But when they may come in helpful for you is on routed transactions. If you have a customer who's actually going to be using their own freight forwarder to file AES, then this is a time where you can give all the information on the SLI, just don't sign it. Okay? Always, in any kind of form, any kind of government form, try to have no blank fields. A blank field gives a reason to ask a question. So instead, make sure in each field that you're either putting the information, or if it's non-applicable, detailing non-applicable, or using a yes/no attribute to those type of questions. Okay, that's also going to help you to make sure that your shipment moves quickly, because the freight forwarder is also not going to have to ask you questions about things such as if there's a TIB, a temporary import bond, or if there's something such as if it's hazardous material. So make sure you're filling out all of those blocks.
Excellent. So just touch base real quick. USMCA, also known as CUSMA, also known as TMEC, it's coming up on a year, July 1st. It's hard to believe it came up that fast. One of the things, a form's no longer required by the customs authorities in Mexico, in the US or Canada. However, customs, Mohawk, everybody has a form that captures the essential data elements that are required. You know, one of the forms you can't use because it doesn't have the required data elements is the old NAFTA form. So keep this in mind. Is if you're still using a NAFTA form, then you probably need to take a review with this. The rules changed, Kristen, you know, obviously, and with that, people have to understand the new requirements. It's kind of a clean slate in some ways, and it actually helps a lot of companies that because the rules actually lessened for a lot of commodities. So it's a good thing, but you know, more to follow on Thursday if anybody has questions on it.
And Jim, actually, I'm going to jump onto a question here, trying to conserve our time here a little bit. that we had somebody who asked us that what if the end user has a non-disclosure agreement and cannot share the end location? Are we as an exporter responsible for any penalty if the goods end up in the hands of an embargoed country? So the first thing that I think of when I hear that question is red flag. If they're not willing to tell you, there's one of two reasons. One is that they're just trying to be proprietary and don't want you going to their customer directly. This is where you need to have a conversation about US regulations and that you're not the only US company who's going to ask for this, and putting in place different controls where maybe they're checking lists and providing you backfeeding information. But that, yes, if they can't provide you that information because of concern about going around them, put that kind of information in your sales agreement to absolve them of that concern. The other part of that is if they're not willing to disclose it, maybe that does indicate that there's an intent to actually end up with goods in an embargoed country. So from my perspective is that if you're getting that type of feedback, you need to be able to move past that, either through documentation or through actually getting the information. What are your thoughts, Jim?
I agree with you on this because you really need that data. How can you go forward with the transaction if you don't have that information? It's going to put you in a really tough spot. And especially when we get to point 2 here on this one. One of the things that I wanted to mention real quick is AES filings. The Customs actually, back in February this year, announced that they were going to be issuing informed compliance notices on certain AES data that's misfiled. So a lot of times we'll have it where the wrong port of export was used. So let's say you're using a courier and you indicate it as being exported out of Newark, but it's a courier hub. So the courier hub has their own special port of export. In a case like that, Customs is going to notify you and they're going to give you between 10 and 15 days to correct transportation related data. If it's not corrected within that time frame, then they'll consider issuing penalties. But this is a lot softer and friendlier than before, where we used to see letters where people say use the wrong port of export. How many times have you seen it where you might have had something that was coming out of Manchester, New Hampshire and being exported out of Logan, and someone put down Manchester, New Hampshire, and they got a penalty for that. So this was good and welcome news. What about military end uses, Kristen?
Oh, the breaking subject for this year, has been all about military end use and military end users. The focus on the US government has been about China, Russia, Venezuela, but this is one of those that very easily we can see becoming a broader topic and very important for people to stay on top of, particularly if you're dealing with those three countries. What this is, the concern now is on goods, is that if it not only could be a military end use, being that they're going to use your product in something military related, but back to what Jim said about the company that's doing good civil appropriate manufacturing or repair work, but they may also have a military line. Is there the potential that the military end user could end up with their product even in a civilian application? So this is where the government's looking particularly at those governments, China, Russia, and Venezuela, and deciding that we need to be concerned about that type of diversion, that a company with a commercial purpose could end up giving it to a military end user. So the regulations on this keep changing. They keep evolving and giving us new guidance. We definitely want people to stay on top of this if you're dealing with those type of countries or thinking of expanding into those. They have listed a couple of entities under the regulations for us, but they're also expecting a lot of due diligence out of you as the exporters.
Thanks, Kristen.
And we had one more question, Jim.
Okay.
So what role responsibility does a manufacturer have if their role in a transaction is as a third party merely manufacturing an engineering print to spec received from a US company that may or may not be exporting the item? So I'm reading this question, and that person, if you want to join us, please feel free to. I believe you're speaking from the perspective then as like a contract manufacturer who's merely only doing what the US party has asked them to do. Your customer in that case is that US corporation that you're doing the manufacturing for. So that's where them as the ultimate, they're going to be also listed as a manufacturer in the transaction. They have to make sure that their controls for what they're doing and distributing that product is correctly. Now, how their technical knowledge may be an issue for you. If they've sent you documents or any kind of schematic that has technical data, you may actually have to also be making sure that within your plant that you don't have foreign persons involved in that assembly line. So that can bring up a couple of different things. But yes, if you're manufacturing for somebody in the US, you're going to have some basic things in place. That destination control statement that goods are governed by the US is something that we really say should be on as much documentation as possible. But if you're making it for them, ultimately they're going to be responsible unless they've given you knowledge. If they have said to you, you have to hurry up and get this done by Friday because it's got to go to Iraq, now you have knowledge. Okay. And that's where hopefully in those type of transactions, it is their US entity who's taking care of all the shipping. But once you have knowledge, you can't self-blind to it.
Second thing here, Kristen, I think that's rather important too, is if for some reason that third party or the person, the order party asks for you to classify it, and for some reason someone inside your building classifies the goods, they're binding you as a company on this thing, and that can be a potential risk. Because I know of a situation that happened on Long Island. It's got to be 14, 15 years ago now, where I think there was 108 violations where they advised people buying this product that it was EAR 99, and so that's what they use to export the goods.
And I hope that helps the person who asked. Okay, and a couple of requests. Excellent, great.
Just real quick, everyone, this is Brian. We have about 4 minutes, if that's okay with Jim and Kristen, to answer a couple more questions.
Okay, so we have, if you file your goods as EAR 99 and ship to a customer in a non-embargoed country, are there any ramifications to the shipper if your customer then ships to an embargoed country? That goes back again to that concept of knowledge. If you have reason to know that information, if you've asked the right questions, you said, what are you going to do with the product? And they say they're going to sell it within their own market and it goes somewhere else. There is only so much that you can control of the next hand as long as you've asked the questions and done the due diligence. Okay? Think about the days when, you broke the mug, but you blamed your little brother. So if little brother gets in trouble, he's going to turn around and say, big sister was the one who said it was okay. So you don't want to have yourself in a position where they come back and say, company XYZ never said I can't transfer this to Iran. What are you talking about? So this is making sure you've done the due diligence. And when you're shipping to that non-embargoed country, you're going to have that destination control statement on there. And that's going to be your big old CYA that they need to follow U.S. export rules. Okay.
Excellent. And Kristen, also, if there is an this one's EAR 99, but if there was an ECCN number, it would be advisable to have it on that invoice.
Okay. And I do see another question here, which I like this one, and I've had to deal with this one multiple times. Does one need a TAA or a license if foreign military, South Korea in this case, personnel want to visit the U.S. manufacturing facility for a photo op of a controlled item, being that, actually this one's 9A991. So for 9A991, if you're looking at that, odds are you're not going to end up, don't quote me though, don't believe there's going to be much of a control for Korea on that. But if it was the 9A001, this goes back to Jason, that if they're going to be outside taking a picture in front of it, perfectly fine. You could actually do that on an airfield, right? But if they're going to come in and want to take a cross section or any kind of photos of the technical documentation, visit the engineering station, the manufacturing line, the test queue, anything beyond what's public domain, being that outer surface outside look on the actual product, then you may potentially need an export license. But outside, here's a product and I'm going to stand by it and take a picture, you're fine. I had this pop up once with a piece of scientific apparatus which had a cross section that people could view. We had to control foreign nationals because in the cross section, you could see some of the intellectual property. So it was important not to have that on display. But if somebody's looking at the outer encased, you should be good to go. But if you want to talk a little bit more on your specifics, Jim or I are more than happy to speak with you. Okay. So Jim, you can take this one.
And this is going to be the last question, everyone.
Okay. What are best practices if goods are sold en route and your customer is not wanting to provide you on the information on who is getting the product? Well, I know what I'd say. What do you think, Jim?
I think this sounds like it's full of risk a little bit here, Kristen. What do you think? What would you recommend on this, you think?
Well, I'd say in the US that it's not true. Snitches don't all get stitches. If you've got a customer who is not willing to tell you once you've sold the goods en route where it's going to, and you have reason to believe, or, because of their vagueness that this could be going somewhere it shouldn't, those are the times where your local enforcement groups want to hear from you. They want to know what entities overseas are trying to disguise transactions and are not being open with the US. So again, keep in mind, they could come back later on and say that you hadn't given them the information, it can't go to that country or to that user. So if they're not willing to give that to you, have a very open conversation with them, particularly if it's a repeat customer. But then you may need to make a decision on if it's something that you should report.
Exactly. And Office of Export Enforcement encourages things like this because a lot of times they may follow this shipment all the way to the final end.
They'll thank you for your call, and you may not ever hear from them again on it. And I know our ports, Jim in particular, I'm out here in the greater Boston area. Our port is extremely friendly with the trade community that if something doesn't feel right, they want to hear from you. They want to know you did your due diligence. But if it's still not feeling right, to be able to give them a call. It helps them in the long run too. Okay?
All right,
Sound
thanks.
good?
Oops, sorry about that, but our time is up. I want to thank Jim and Kristen with Mohawk Global for